name is Zvezdan Kalmar. I'm coming from Serbia, from environmental organization, which was also involved in the modeling for, later will be presented, product of that modeling for region of Southeast Europe. I was struck a little bit, I mean, with your, from Denmark, with your comment about the change, which should go not only in direction of the change of the, let's say, structure, but you also raised very clearly the question of the change of the, I would call it distribution of the ownership or distribution of the benefit. In the sense of, I will even go in direction of saying like profit benefits, because we are living in corporate world. And looking at the German situation, as far as I know, the most of the inventions needed for the solar panels are actually owned by maybe few companies. So practically we have one bottleneck in whole world related to the prices of the solar. So looking at the pressing interest of whole planet for transition, how come that we never actually ask the question why we don't make those inventions necessary for the penetration of solar public interest and practically open up the knowledge, absolutely, without any guarantee for the profit for those companies or those inventors? Because without such thing, we will actually significantly postpone reduction of the price. Even though the prices are going down, I see that we are living in the framework in coordinate system, which is actually keeping us from better penetration, if you understand me. This is similar like in the coal technology or steel technologies needed for the production of the thermopower plants. You actually have the bottleneck of production of steel components for the turbines, for the generators rather. So that is the reason why these products are so expensive. So what is your take on that? What to do with those inventions necessary to actually finally make a green revolution? Because if we are constantly counting through the subsidies, to the green interventions, through the feed-in tariffs and others, we are counting some profits to those companies who are owners of those inventions necessary for the solar and wind turbines. We are actually continuing in the same system. We are having same pattern. We are guaranteeing the extra profits to those companies, and we are somehow under the pressure to guarantee it, practically giving space to the grid as the, not grid network, but grid as the human characteristics, which is actually some kind of monopoly again. We are again having some kind of monopoly, and we are not providing for the redistribution, and we are not opening actually globally the situation where the resources will be finally harvested from the nature. Thank you.
Do you want to answer prompt, or do we collect other questions, short questions?
It was a very long question. Let's see if I can remember all of it, or I'll reply to the parts that I do actually remember. In the transition that we've made in Denmark, a lot of it has been about establishing a level playing field for any producer of electricity to enter the market. So it is not, I mean, if you go back to before, let's say 1975, it was very limited who could actually connect to the grid. So it is about establishing grid codes so that anyone can connect. It's about establishing the right of third-party access. And actually, I would say that even though the well-established companies in Denmark, they are still very active, they are not doing very well because they're actually being beaten on the market. I can take an example. We have the state-owned Swedish power company Vattenfall, who bought a few coal-fired power plants in Denmark some years ago. But they just sold one of them, and they're trying to sell the other one because they're simply not making a profit because of all the newcomers on the market. And the newcomers on the market, they can be large institutional investors, but they can also, to a very large extent, be small-scale investors. A lot of the wind turbine development that we had in Denmark, that was small-scale investors. I mean, it would be typical for the village I lived in. My parents, they bought shares in a wind turbine cooperative when I was a kid in the 80s. And there you would have maybe 100 families joining together, and then you would buy a few wind turbines together. And that was completely outside of the normal traditional power sector. But of course, you had to have the possibility of doing that. I mean, you had to have the right of access to the grid. It should not be in a situation that the grid owner can say you cannot connect. You should have specific rules: who pays for what, who pays for the transformer station, for instance, who pays for the distribution line that goes to the wind turbine, who pays for all this stuff. So you have to have set rules for this to have a true third-party access. The same with the PV panels. I mean, Christian, you ought to speak about, because you have much more PV, but we have a bit in Denmark, but that is to a very large extent also on individual houses. So we do have this transition from the large traditional institutional producers to much more distributed consumer-owned production. But it is an interesting issue, and I can mention when I was a student in 1995, I think, there was a decision made about a coal-fired power plant in my town. And there you had all the establishment, they wanted the coal-fired power plant. And then you had the NGOs, they wanted something else, but the establishment, they were the ones who were well organized. And even things like the union, because the union, they knew that if they were going to build a 400 megawatt power plant, we would create a lot of jobs for that. Whereas all the opponents, they did not really have, they had some vague ideas saying, okay, we should have some decentralized CHP and district heating, but they couldn't come up with a proposal, say yes, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is where the money is going to come from. So I remember being in a public hearing where we had someone from the union saying we should have a big power plant because it creates jobs, and then suddenly you had 500 people standing up and cheering. I think, and then it turned out that they had taken the entire union to this meeting to make sure that the power plant was built, because they had a very strong interest in that, and all the opponents of that power plant, they could not muster the same resistance to it. So we have this shift that we are going towards these small-scale investor production facilities, but we do also have this institutional resistance to it. Maybe it answers your question. Otherwise, you'll have to follow up.
No, I was more asking about the global situation, because in Germany it's just natural that you have 5,000 euro to invest. In other countries you don't, and that is simply because of the expensive solar panel, which is expensive just because the inventions are not publicly available.
If I may quickly follow up on specifically the PV thing, I think there is, or I would like to point out maybe to distinguish between the public good related to research and development, and indeed I think there is a strong role for R&D to progress with technology development on the PV front also, but at the same time we need these deployment policies for simply scaling up the existing technology. And there we sort of have to rely on the learning curve by simply building more, which is then more a commodity thing, and probably also something for companies and private companies. And indeed, most of the learning rates I've shown you were because of this scale-up of one specific technology within PV and not so much within R&D, so I did not consider technology breakthroughs. And in essence, maybe in short, I would say it's both. We need the public engagement in R&D, and we need the scale-up through commoditization.
Thank you. Anyone else? You can also ask Orsi and Béla, the presenters of the first session.
Oh, thank you. I will be interested on the question about the so-called energy transition, Energiewende, which takes a little bit different shape than the planned one in the past, I think. So my question is about right now, it makes more sense to have a big-scale renewable energy power plants in Germany, for example. In the economic aspect, and when would the time begin to come that the smaller sized plants begin to make more sense? It's a very much political issue, and also let's say an issue of the regulations. My question is going in the direction of equalizing the owner communities. For example, we have one big block of apartments. We have 100 apartments, and we want also to create a micro power plant. And we also want to create, let's say, an economical entity. Yeah, and up to now, it happens very rarely, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense up to now, unfortunately. So my question is, are you already working in this direction? Because we are trying to, but it's a very tough market, let's say. Yeah?
I would say that this development is indeed already happening in Germany. I have to admit, indeed, I just showed the numbers for large-scale PV, but of course there are also feed-in tariffs for small-scale installations, and historically, till a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, it was the feed-in tariff which also triggered the installation of small-scale PV. Nowadays, it's not the feed-in tariff anymore. It's because there's the incentive for self-consumption and avoiding buying electricity from the grid. The feed-in tariff in Germany for small-scale PV is lower than the household electricity price, so you don't have any incentive anymore, but you also don't need any incentive, rather than you substitute your grid consumption. And then, let's say we run into some technology or resource constraints, because the solar conditions are not that perfect in Germany, so a household cannot completely go off-grid. It can consume, or it can compensate 30% of its annual electricity consumption by decentral PV, and if you install a battery, you can maybe go to 50%, and if you couple with your heating, you can go up to 80%, but you cannot go completely off-grid. So that's now, I would say, the main incentive for households, but you, of course, relate to or point out a very important issue. Not everyone owns a house, but quite many people are also renting space. And there is no legal provision implemented yet, but this summer Germany revised its renewable support law, where there was the key new paragraph that also now the regulator has to develop a model for the so-called Mieterstrom. So how, is it tenants? Is tenants the English word? Yeah. How tenants can install PV on a larger house, so to speak. So that I would expect a big boost on that front. And maybe just a very quick remark regarding the ownership. Very special is also that it's mostly owned by private households, by farmers, by citizens, and the large energy companies only own a minority of the installed renewables capacity in Germany. 10%, I think a couple of years ago, so currently it's I think 15% of the capacity is owned by the large utilities, the rest private households.
In the time of the very well-funded projects.
Yeah, yeah. But now, I mean, the good thing is the things are cheaper than the electricity price, so yeah.